And we are live. Hello and welcome to Fermenting Opinions. I'm your host, David Hyden, and this is Fermenting Opinions, the podcast in search of a more palatable political and today theological ferment. I am joined today by Mr. John Richards and Mr. Nick Peters for their second formal debate between themselves. Today we are debating the resurrection of Jesus Christ. I'm going to let you guys each introduce yourselves in turn. John, I will start with you. John, tell us a little bit about who you are.
Yeah, sure. I go by my current title, which is President of Atheism UK. And if you want a bit more history about me, I'm a retired science teacher who can't stop. And I've got my own YouTube channel, which is called Free Thought Productions. And how much else do you want to know? Is that okay?
That sounds good, unless you want to include more. And there'll be a little bit of time at the end if people want to add things. Nick, sir, first start off, thank you for being able to make it today. Nick's a little bit under the weather, so he's hanging in there with us, and we appreciate him putting in the effort there. So Nick, how are you doing? And you want to tell us a little bit about yourself, sir?
Well, how I'm doing isn't the best, so I hope whenever John's speaking, you have me on mute because of my sinuses here.
Okay.
But, well, I'm Nick Peters. I'm with Deeper Waters Apologetics. I do affirm the virgin birth, in case anyone out there is wondering about that one. But my role is just I write articles regularly on apologetics. I'm hopefully going to be accepted soon into New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary, moving down there. And I will be on, hopefully, before too long again with David here. And hopefully with my friend Erin Burnett talking about autism in the church, as she and I are both autistic Christians. And I would like to remind everyone, please remember, at least here in the States, it is Autism Awareness Month, so be aware of us.
Very good. It's also an issue that's kind of near to my heart. It's my career path is working with individuals on the spectrum, amongst other things. So thank you guys both for joining. The format for the debate, and we'd agreed on this, and I just want to make sure everyone is on the same page before we get started. It's going to be 20-minute openers for each, 10-minute rebuttals, 10 for questioning. That's going to be one person in the hot seat. The other person is going to be asking them questions, and try to keep respectful with that time and not ask questions back and things of that nature. After that, there'll be kind of a 10-minute sort of open floor discussion where you guys can kind of hammer out anything you weren't finished talking about, perhaps. And then we're going to do 3-minute closers for each. Does that sound good to you guys?
Yeah.
Very good. Very good. I'm not particular as to who wants to get started. Is there anybody have a preference to go first?
I think probably since I'm making the positive case, I should be the first one.
That's sounds fine to me. John, are you good with that?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. All right.
That works well.
I will take you to the solo layout, and I will get ready to set the time here. Timer, 18, 19, 20. And whenever you are ready, start talking, and I will start the time.
Hello, everyone. As we do this debate today, it is actually Good Friday, a name that seems quite ironic because very few of us, even from a skeptical perspective, would perhaps say, yeah, don't think the crucifixion of a man like Jesus is a good thing. I remember years ago watching the series The Bible, and that was one produced by Roma Downey and her husband. And yeah, naturally they took some liberties with text, but when Pilate crucifies Jesus, sometime after that he says, he'll be forgotten within a week. And you all thought 2 weeks to flatten the curve was a long time. That week so far hasn't died out. Of course, it's doubtful Pilate said that, but that's the whole idea still. Because this event came after a crucifixion, had something that was totally unexpected. That's that before too long, the claim was Jesus has risen from the dead and is alive again. And this is really the most important news of all. As I sit here, looking at my screen, looking above, I see one of my best friends. He has 4 legs and he meows a lot. But I think this little kitty has been with me for about 10 years. One day, sadly, he won't be. Death is such a great separator for so many of us that the hope of resurrection can be seen as a very good thing. So even if someone is skeptical, I think if you have one loved one you'd like to see again, you'd want to look and see, is this true? Well, naturally, the first place to start, contrary to what many skeptics might think, is actually the epistles of Paul. In the epistles, we're going to go with 2 that bar none, no scholar, except perhaps some fringe questions that Paul wrote this. Those are 1 Corinthians and Galatians. Now, Galatians gives us a timeline of when Paul goes to meet the apostles in Jerusalem. And based on that timeline, we infer that Paul got the information in 1 Corinthians 15 from the apostles, and then he delivered it to the Corinthians. And that takes place, we said, in 1 Corinthians 15, and how he says, now what I received, I passed on to you. Now, some of us looking at that can look and say, well, geez, that seems pretty basic. Of course, it was passed on. But what's going on here is Paul is giving the language of oral tradition. And what he is giving us then right after that is a short creedal formula. So it starts, Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures. This one should be pretty much a no-brainer for us. But unfortunately, it isn't. I'm only going to make some brief statements here. Gerd Ludemann, the fact of the death of Jesus as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable, despite hypotheses of a pseudo-death or deception, which are sometimes put forward. It need not be discussed further here. And Barnum and Christians who wanted to proclaim Jesus as Messiah would not have invented the notion that he was crucified, because his crucifixion created such a scandal. Indeed, the Apostle Paul calls it the chief stumbling block for Jews. Where did the tradition come from? It must have actually happened. Dale Martin, Jesus was executed by crucifixion, which was a common method of torture and execution used by the Romans. And also that Jesus was executed because he or someone else was claiming that he was the king of the Jews seems to be historically accurate. John Dominic Crossan, Jesus' execution is as historically certain as any ancient event can ever be. But what about all those very specific details that throughout the story? All of these are backing with support from New Testament scholars that I've just cited that show Jesus was crucified. And yes, Jesus died on the cross. The Journal of the American Medical Association looked at the account and said, yep, he was dead. And the only account we really have of someone barely even surviving was Josephus talks about seeing 3 of his friends being crucified during the siege on Jerusalem. And he asked to have him brought down. They'll give him the best of medical care. I think only one of them survived. Not only that, David Strauss years ago said that if Jesus had just swooned on the cross and somehow got out of his tomb, and as you can say, he didn't even have to roll a rock out of the way or anything. He got out of his tomb and went to his disciples and knocked on the door. Peter is not going to look at him and say, wow, this is a Lord of life who conquered the dead. I want to get a body like that someday. No, Peter is going to call him a doctor immediately. Now, the buried account, again, Paul says he was buried, which is very common in Jewish circles. There's not much that goes into this because it's, like I said, a rather common thing. Just like he died, he buried, and then he rose again. Now, how does Paul back this claim? Well, he says that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, and I've had more than 500 brothers at the same time, most of whom are still living. Some have fallen asleep. I mean, he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and then Paul says, as a footnote, which obviously isn't part of the creed, last of all, he appeared to me, as to one abnormally born. So here's where we are. Jesus dies, Jesus is buried, but Jesus is seen alive again. Do any New Testament scholars have anything to say about this? Yes. We can say with complete certainty that some of his disciples at some later time insisted that he soon appeared to them, convincing them that he had been raised from the dead. That's Bart Ehrman right there. That Jesus' followers and later Paul had resurrection experiences is, in my judgment, a fact. What reality was that gave rise to the experiences, I do not know. E.P. Sanders. And Gerd Ludemann, again, the only thing that we can certainly say to be historical is that there were resurrection appearances in Galilee and in Jerusalem soon after Jesus' death. These appearances cannot be denied. So again, if someone wants to deny that these appearances happen, they're arguing against New Testament scholarship largely as a whole. Again, there's going to be people on the fringe who might question this, but really what's said is non-disputable. Even when James Crossley and Gary Habermas debated on the Unbelievable podcast once, and Gary Habermas brought out all these statements in 1 Corinthians 15, and Crossley was asked, do you want to dispute any of them? He said, no, not a single one of them. 1 Corinthians 15 is a gold mine. Because this information, it doesn't come late. It comes at the latest within 5 years of the resurrection event. Most dated even earlier than that. Some have dated it to within even a few months of the event. You're not going to find any dispute then that this is an early creed that the Christians took extremely seriously and was used quite likely perhaps as a sort of baptismal formula to help with new converts. So the explanation has to be given. What is the cause of this? Now, Paul contends the cause is Jesus rose from the dead. Because normally, if there had been appearances, we would think of seeing something like Jesus in Abraham's bosom, for example. But that wasn't what was claimed. The claim was he was alive. He was physically walking around. Now, some people would say this was a hallucination. We've got some poems that, first off, one would have to present examples of definitive mass hallucinations. And good luck finding those, because hallucinations, by their definition, are subjective, individual experiences. Now, if a bunch of people see one thing and they see it wrongly, that's not a hallucination. That's a misseeing of something. What it's being claimed is there was a real referent that people were seeing, and they were seeing it in groups. There's at least 3 groups mentioned in the creed. And also, as N.T. Wright has pointed out, if you saw someone alive normally after they had died, it wouldn't convince you in the ancient world that they were alive. It would convince you they were dead. And yet, the followers of Jesus took the exact opposite approach and said he was alive, essentially signing their own death notes at that point. When we look at the ancient world, we see that the Christian claim runs contrary to pretty much everything else out there. For instance, in our day and age, new is good. I've got my Android phone plugged in here. When a phone comes out, what's everyone looking for? The new one. You have to have the new phone. You want everything to be updated. But in the ancient world, generally it was the opposite. The old was much more reliable. A new religion would be looked on with suspicion because where the gods or God revealed himself or themselves long ago, and it's not going to be in some newfangled thing. And for a while, Christians were seen as Jews of a sort. Before too long, it was clear, no, Christians aren't Jews. Christians also were seen as largely intolerant. And this was because they did not accept the Roman gods. They were often told, go and make your sacrifices just, in the name of the emperor and offer a little bit of incense. Even if you do it just for show, why not do this? But they refused. They said directly, there is no king but Jesus. And this was a challenge to Jews and Gentiles both. Jews would look at Jesus as a failed Messiah figure, and crucified on a cross was the same thing to them as hung on a tree meant he was under God's curse. Gentiles would look at Jesus and say, he was crucified, end of story, we don't need to go further. No crucified man will be a king. And yet this is exactly what the followers of Jesus claimed. Jesus' followers also claimed that he rose from the dead bodily, which was again very different from what was expected. Because as Crossan and Reed say in their book on Paul, to return to the body in that world would be like to return to a prison. This is why heresies like Gnosticism and Docetism were so popular in the time of Jesus, because by these philosophies you could say matter was evil and we don't need to be connected to the body, which could lead to either strong asceticism. After all, why should we bring children into this world when we're just giving more bodies for people to have? Or a whole thing of, let's go ahead and sleep around all we want because what happens to the body really doesn't matter. And by the way, in the Corinthian church, you'll find both of those attitudes. But like I said, Jesus was different in this regard. Jesus was said to have resurrected in the body, and because of that, everyone else would be resurrected in the body. And Christians contended some would be raised to everlasting life, and some would be raised to everlasting shame and contempt. So my claim then for today is resting on some central points. Jesus died by crucifixion. That one should be totally acceptable across the board. Jesus was buried, and then Jesus was seen alive again in such a way that convinced his followers that he had risen from the dead. I've said mass hallucination is usually one way we go to avoid this. Some might say theft hypotheses, and if they want to do that, if John wants to go that route, he'll have to show that. Another route that's usually gone is the pagan copycat claim, which really doesn't hold up well at all. Not even according to skeptical scholars like Bart Ehrman. And even if there were copycats, it doesn't discount the data that we do have for the historical Jesus and the event of the resurrection. Another favorite is cognitive dissonance. But usually most people who go this route haven't read, for instance, Leon Festinger's work When Prophecy Fails, which was the main working book put forward to argue for cognitive dissonance. And they don't realize cognitive dissonance normally just affects the main group that it goes with, and it doesn't go beyond that group generally in a large way. Unfortunately, this is exactly what happened with Christianity, in that it grew so much after the so-called disconfirming event. Christianity was on the rise, and even if someone wants to say it was because of Constantine that everything changed, by the time of Constantine even, the empire was probably about 10 to 20% Christian, and there was no indication that it was going to stop growing at any rate. So I would contend eventually things would have happened either way. Constantine just sped up the process. But all this data together leads me to conclude Jesus did indeed rise from the dead. And there is hope for everyone else out there who's lost a loved one. I did my grandmother's funeral shortly after I was married. And I contended there, she's going to rise again. And I still contend the same thing, because Jesus rose from the dead. And that's going to be me.
Nick, just a FYI, you do still have 2 minutes left. You're comfortable suiting that time?
Yeah.
Okay. Very good. Let me take you off the solo layout and we're gonna unmute John. John, did you want this? Let me see here. This one.
Yeah, I'm not quite ready for it yet. First of all, I wanted to thank Nick for turning up, because he's obviously suffering, poor lad, and I do give him my sympathy, because we've all had that sort of condition. It's prevalent, isn't it, in this age and day of COVID and similar sorts of complaints. So yeah, if you could now share my presentation, I'll get it full screen for you.
Go ahead.
Okay. There.
Oh.
That's big.
I don't even know how you're doing that. You're more of an expert at StreamYard than I am.
I've been using StreamYard for a couple of years now, David.
But
Yeah.
you're ahead of the curve. I'm still catching up, but looks good.
I wouldn't claim to be an expert, though. In fact, I have a producer for my shows who's even more of an expert than me.
Well, there you go. There you go. So,
Yeah.
all right. So whenever you want to get ready, first of all, thank you, guys who are participating in the chat. I'm not reading them during these presentations, but they're reading them out loud rather. But I'm following along. So continue on. So John, just like as with Nick, as soon as you get started talking, I'll mute us and I'll start the time.
Okay. So, go. To debate whether Jesus rose from the dead, we must first assume that he lived. And that in itself is a contentious matter. The Jesus mythicism movement is growing, and the judgment is, the jury is probably still out over that. Anyway, you've all come along to see a debate on whether Jesus rose from the dead. So thank you for coming, audience, future or present. I shall play that game and give you what you've come for. That's dubious. So, what we have to do in situations like this is to ask questions about the source of the claim. Who is making the claim? And in this case, we know it's priests and pastors and apologists and people who make the claim, religious Christians. We need to know how they know that their claim is worthy. And it's doubtful that they can really be experts in events that are supposed to have happened 2,000 years ago. So we need to investigate that thoroughly. They say, of course, and Nick has just said this, that it's written in their scriptures. So it's in black and white, if you like. But that doesn't mean that it's true, because the Royal Society, the world's oldest science academy, has as its motto, nullius in verba, nothing in words. And the other thing we need to check is what's in it for them. Is the source impartial, or do the claimants benefit in some way? And I shall come back to this slide later on in my presentation. So let's have a look at what the claim might be. First of all, I'm not going to claim that Jesus didn't rise from the dead. I can't claim that. I don't have any evidence for it. What I am going to do is cast doubt on the proposition that Jesus did rise from the dead, and you've already heard Nick try to support it. So looking at this picture now, there are many very well documented cases of humans having been brought back from apparent death, thanks mainly to the use of a defibrillator within about 8 minutes. But that's not resurrection, that's resuscitation. We can rule that out. Now, Nick mentioned, what did he call it? The copycat. I forget what word he used. The copycat. Yeah, he called them copycats. Other gods that claim to be resurrected. But of course, you can only be a copycat after the first cat. You can't copy previously. That doesn't make sense. So let's have a look at this other resurrected God's claim. And there's lots of them. That one's Zoroaster, there's Cyrus, Adonis, Attis, Tammuz, Balder, Quetzalcoatl, that one, Inzanami and Ishtar, those are the Japanese ones. So you can see, and there's another one, forget which one that is. You can see that a god rising from the dead is a popular storyline. But do we believe all those other accounts? No. Why not? It's because of a lack of evidence, isn't it? Okay, so let's take a look at more modern times. We've had decent medical, we've had health going on, organizations which can deliver all sorts of wonderful treatments for, 150 years now, getting steadily better. And in all of that time, there's been no credible records of resurrection happening. There's been lots of people die, lots of people die in hospital, but none of them have come back to life. So the claim that this one person did come back to life, out of all those, I think it's something like 100 million humans who have lived on the planet so far, the one that did come back to life, that's an extraordinary claim out of that large population. So where does it come from? It comes from a book. Jesus is a biblical character. So what's on trial here is really the Bible. It's the veracity of the Bible that's in question. And the Bible, of course, is a book, which is a human fabricated artifact. Now, there are many books. They've all been made by man, and they can include facts, and they can also include fiction. So the important thing to do is to know how to tell fact from fiction. Well, here's one book. This is a telephone directory. If you do remember them, they've disappeared thanks to contact lists on mobile phones. That's a book that you can check. All you have to do is make a number of calls and see whether the person who picks up gives the name that's printed in the book. So that's verifiable. And here's another book. That's a science textbook from a kid's library. And again, you can verify that. All you have to do is repeat the experiments that it describes and see whether you get the results that it reports. The Bible can't pass that test. And of course, some books like to mix fact and fiction. It makes for good reading. And the Bible does this. And so did the Da Vinci Code, and of course, Harry Potter. And that's a picture of King's Cross Station, where there is a platform 9 3/4 written on the wall where you can charge at it and do what Harry Potter supposedly did. And of course, it's a tourist attraction. Now, let's examine the scientificality, is that a word, of the Bible. If the Bible is reasonable, we would be able to check the claims like we do in the telephone directory or the science textbook. We can't do that. It claims things that happened 2,000 or more years ago, and some of them are extremely unlikely, improbable, far-fetched. So we can't really claim that the Bible is scientific in any way. So let's maybe think of it as a history book. Is it a history book? What we've got is a collection of reports. And the police write reports. We ask them to write their reports immediately after an incident in order to minimize the possible loss of information due to them forgetting. And the Gospels are not like that. They, according to what we have in our records, in our evidence, the earliest pieces of Gospel that we have that survive were written at least 30 years after the events they describe. That's a whole generation. They are hearsay, and hearsay wouldn't be acknowledged in a court of law. Additionally, the Gospels were compiled, translated, and edited 300 years later under the directive of Emperor Constantine. So what we have are ancient, unreliable, translated, edited reports. They're a bit like newspaper reports. Now, of course, we treat newspapers as dubious because we know that they are often exaggerated in order to promote sales. If we enjoyed today's sensational stories, we might buy the same paper again tomorrow. It's a commercial enterprise. And the Bible is similarly biased. The gospel storytellers earned money by street preaching. It's a sort of early form of busking. And the Bible has some ripping yarns about virgin births, resurrection, walking on water. It was a money-making performance book in the days when entertainment was scarce. That means that instead of wonderful evidence, what we have is claims of knowledge that are unreliable. They claim to know how the world originated, how the origin of life happened, and they tell us that a talking snake existed and a man lived inside a whale. So instead of the extraordinary claim of that resurrection requires, we find there's no reliable evidence at all. The Gospels are an early form of Netflix. People paid to hear them being told. It's a source of income. The preachers were paid, and they still are. So, are they historically accurate? No. So, as I said, instead of the extraordinary evidence we require, we find there's no evidence. And what we have is neither scientifically nor historically reliable. So let's take a look at that slide again. Who's making this claim? We know it's priests and pastors. How do they know that these claims are correct? Well, they don't. And what's in it for them? A career. That's what's in it for them. Now, does this mean that Jesus did not rise from the dead? I started out by saying I wasn't going to prove that he didn't, remember? So I haven't done that. It doesn't mean what I presented doesn't mean that Jesus did not rise from the dead, but it does put the extraordinary claim that Jesus rose from the dead on a par with other extraordinary claims. What if the motion for this debate was, did Muhammad rise to paradise on the back of Burak, his winged horse? Some say it was a donkey. Would Nick, I ask, consider that claim to be verified by quoting from the Quran? Okay. I'm going to stop there. I don't know how much time I've used, but that's enough for the moment.
Okay, you actually have about 6 minutes and 44 seconds. If you wanted to add anything else to that, or if you want to cede the time, that is also up to you.
I'll cede that time. I'll happily do that.
Very good. So actually, as it turns out, Nick went longer in the first round. I'm going to unmute both of you. Very good. So that concludes the opening statements. Now we're going to go to rebuttals. Rebuttals are going to be 10 minutes each. So Nick, you would go first on rebuttals. Whenever you were ready, let me set the time here. And let me get you up on a full screen here. Whenever you're ready, sir.
Okay. There was a whole lot there, and much of it sounded to me like the kind of stuff you'd see in conspiracy theories, honestly. Let's cover some brief highlights. First off, the idea that Jesus existed is dubious to some extent, and that more and more mythicists are coming up, not in New Testament scholarship party. You pretty much got people like Richard Carrier and Robert Price and a handful of others. This would be like saying geocentrism is being taken as a serious hypothesis because you got some PhDs in the field who hold to geocentrism. Let's look at some quotations I've got here. Rudolf Bultmann. Of course, the doubt as to whether Jesus really existed is unfounded and not worth refutation. No sane person can doubt that Jesus stands as founder behind the historical movement whose first distinct stage is represented by the oldest Palestinian community. Mark Allen Powell. 150 years ago, a very well-known respected scholar named Bruno Bauer maintained that the historical person of Jesus never existed. Anyone who says that today, in the academic world at least, gets grouped with the skinheads who say there was no Holocaust and the scientific holdouts who want to believe the world is flat. Michael James McClyman. Most scholars regard the arguments for Jesus' non-existence as unworthy of any response, on a par with claims that the Jewish Holocaust never occurred or that the Apollo moon landing took place in a Hollywood studio. So that John is going even to this route just even barely is telling. Now, he said a whole lot of things about the Gospels as well, which that can be debated another time, but I never once went to the Gospels in my presentation. I stuck with the epistles of Paul, which are accepted to be from Paul. And if someone wants to talk about what was gained, well, let's see. Paul was an up and rising star in Jewish circles. He was well known to the Sanhedrin. He had his path all laid out to him, and he ended up taking one that ended with him being beaten regularly, stoned, given 39 lashes with a whip, being left overseas, being naked and without food, and eventually beheaded. You know, for perks. So this whole idea then that Paul was getting all these benefits is ridiculous. And there are a number of accounts we have of the death of the apostles, and Sean McDowell has done the most work on this. We can definitely say that Peter, John, James, and most likely Thomas all died, and there was no recanting. We do not have any word of an apostle recanting his position. And also, John brought up the whole pagan copycat theory. There's a reason this is not taken seriously. Even Barnum in his book, Did Jesus Exist?, deals with a lot of these. Let's look at Copsycoder was one that he mentioned. No Christian had even heard of Copsycoder until around 1600 years or so after the resurrection event. Or Baldur, the Norse deity. Let's see. Who wrote down the accounts of these Norse gods later on, hundreds of years later? Oh, that's right. It was the Christians who did that. Or Attis? No, Attis did not have a resurrection. He had a finger that started moving. Again, there is not a resurrection there. Most of these claims are based on a lack of interacting with the scholarship here. Now, he also brought up the whole thing about Muhammad's night flight. Would I take that seriously? Well, this is interesting because I've actually written an article on my blog on Muhammad's night journey here. And what I want to do when I look at this is I say, okay, here's the account of the Quran of Muhammad, which doesn't even mention a flying horse, but I'd be glad to defer to the scholars of Islam and say, well, this language in Arabic does say it, and I say, okay, you are the experts. But what I want to ask also is, what do non-Muslim scholars say about Muhammad in this account? And there isn't any evidence given from them that the story has veracity. But aside from N.T. Wright, who I quoted in my first presentation, every single scholar I quoted is a non-Christian scholar. I didn't go and say, well, here's what my favorite evangelical said. I said, here's what the leading skeptics say about the historical Jesus. And again, everything I've said about Jesus with the claims of his appearances and everything is really beyond dispute. So if John really wants to argue his case, he's going to have to deal with the data that I gave, and none of that has been dealt with. And since that was not dealt with, then my case still stands, and I really don't even need to spend the rest of this time. I'll concede it all happily.
Okie doke. You have 4 minutes left. If there's nothing else you want to add?
Nope.
Okie doke. I guess that's all you need, sir. I'm going to go to unmuting you, and I will mute you, Nick, and we will go boom. And alrighty.
Okay.
John, sir, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, thank you for that. Well, I showed one slide of whether Jesus lived or not and pointed out that it is under debate. It's not a foregone, evidential, unfalsifiably proven truth. So, and I left it at that. I just passed over that because I made the point that for him to have died, he first must have been alive. Now, there's no need to go into further debate about that. It's just, let's move on. So, as for whether or not Nick quoted the Gospels, well, that's not relevant because the Gospels are well known to be the most looked for, sought after source of this claim that Jesus rose from the dead. And I accept that Nick used the epistles of Paul and mentioned Corinthians and Galatians and so on, not the Gospels. But the whole point is those things, the Galatians, the Corinthians, and the Gospels, are all in a single book. And for history to be credible, multiple corroborating contemporary written accounts are required. And the Bible is one source. It doesn't have corroboration, contemporary corroboration written at the time of the claims. And let's move on from that. Early on, Nick expressed the hope of resurrection. Well, fine. You know, we'd all love to come back. We'd all love not to die. But this is not substantiating a claim. This is wishful thinkianity. I'm a bit worried because allegedly Jesus died for my sins, but he only died temporarily, just for a couple of nights, and then he came back. So I'm worried now that my sins have not been properly died for. Now, Nick mentioned a lot of other non-relevant things. He mentioned Josephus, who saw 3 of his friends crucified. Well, then they weren't Jesus. It's not relevant. Don't bring it to this party. And then he went on to make a vast number of appeals to authority. And notice that I didn't appeal to any authorities at all. I made a case based on reasoning, what we know and what we don't know. But he mentioned Bart Ehrman, E.P. Saunders, N.T. Wright, Gord, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, Gord Ludemont, James Crossley, Gary Habermas. These are appeals to authority. He's talking constantly about the scholars and the scholarship. That those people have opinions. We are looking for evidence. These are 2 different things. However, he did say a couple of things that I agree with. For example, he said, to be risen must be risen in the body. I'm not going to argue with that. If there is such a phenomenon as rising from the dead, I want to see it in the body, because as far as I'm concerned, there is no evidence for such a thing as a spirit. And the other thing he said that I have got no quarrel with at all was, where is it now? Something else he said that, yeah, I agree that if these claims turn out to be based in hallucinations, that's easy to knock down, because as Nick correctly said, hallucinations are subjective, individual experiences, and they just don't happen. You can be fooled. An illusionist will fool you, but that's not a hallucination. So what we're questioning here is the record, and what is recorded was not recorded by witnesses. Let me give you an example. About 50 years ago, my grandfather, who was close to his last days then, told me that 70 years before, he had driven Queen Victoria in one of the first cars on the Isle of Wight. Do you believe that? I'll leave it there.
Okay, you have 4 minutes and 30 seconds remaining. You're willing to cede that time?
Yep, ceded.
Very good. I'm going to unmute Nick. I'm going to change it to this format here, because this will be sort of the question period or cross examination period.
Mhm.
Nick will be able to go first. He will ask you questions, John. Try not to ask questions back in return. I know sometimes it can turn into a little bit of a conversation more than a questioning period. Let's just try to keep it to questions. Nick, you will have 10 minutes to do this. You let me know when you want to start.
Let me take a quick drink here.
Good call.
Okay. John, one of the things you talk about is the likelihood of things like this happening and your skepticism. I'm kind of wondering, do you believe in the existence of meteorites?
This isn't relevant. This is a
I
red
think it
herring
is.
or a moving of the goalposts.
So you're unable to answer if you believe in meteorites or not.
Well, I am, but it's not part of this debate.
Actually, it is, because there was a time when the start of the Enlightenment when stories of meteorites were not treated seriously at all. That this was just what the ignorant people believed, but the scientific community knew so much better. As Pierre Simon Laplace said, we already know enough such fables, and even Antoine Lavoisier actually changed one affidavit, arguing that rocks must have been artificially warmed. It's a good idea to not do that. But then there was a great meteorite shower one day, and everything changed because of new evidence. But John, see, the point is, if we went by your contention, then when everyone back then would have said there's no such thing as meteorites, no matter what evidence happened, then we'd still be arguing the exact same way. That's very similar to your approach to miracles.
Well, okay. Do I get to respond to that now? Miracles are also not part of this debate, and except for one miracle, the claim of rising from the dead. So it's not miracles, plural. It's a single miracle. Now I want to know what you think.
Wait. I'm sorry. I gotta jump in and stop you. Remember, it's Nick asking questions. Save that for when it's your turn. That's
Sure.
I know you guys want to get into it, but I'm trying to maintain the structure here. Okay.
It was relevant to the meteorite story, you see. So that's why I wanted to feed it back in here.
Just try and save it for when it's your turn. Nick, you go back ahead. I paused your time.
Okay, John, what is the appeal to authority fallacy?
I'm sorry?
What is the appeal to authority fallacy?
It's calling upon superior experts, so-called, your chosen superior experts, to bolster your case.
That's not the appeal to authority fallacy. Because the appeal to authority fallacy is appealing to an authority who is not an authority in the relevant field. If you are quoting someone in the relevant field, that is entirely acceptable. Scientists do this, historians do this, most everyone does this. I did this just this afternoon when I went to see my doctor, and he said, here's what I think you should do. And I went with his authority because I'm not a medical expert. If you think that is the appeal to authority, then you are saying by your authority, we should not accept appeals to authority, so we shouldn't accept your appeal to authority, but we shouldn't accept appeals to authority.
Can I review my answer to your question?
Okay.
The appeal to authority, I've got it written here. The appeal to authority is saying that because an authority thinks something, comma, it must therefore be true. That's the definition of appeal to authority.
Except I've never argued that. I've said we have these authorities who back this, and if these are authorities in the field who are experts, if you are going to argue against the experts, you need to have some good evidence in your case. Why would so many skeptical scholars say, yes, that Jesus was believed to be seen alive again? Are they trying to toot horns for evangelicalism?
You're quoting their opinions. There is no necessary or essential correspondence between what an authority says and truth.
Tell me, what New Testament scholars have you read lately?
Irrelevant.
I'm going to guess the answer is none, then.
Guess away.
Because it's entirely relevant if you even fear it. It would be just as relevant if I was coming here arguing, say, against evolution, which I'm not, and saying, yeah, I haven't read any of the scientists. I don't care what they say. John, how do we know anything from the ancient world?
Well, as I explained, depends what you mean by ancient. Historical information is based on the written word. History means reading words, going back. If there are no words, that's called prehistory, okay? And the way we know whether historical claims are acceptable or not is by getting multiple corresponding contemporary accounts, not just one book.
We only have the account of Plato that Socrates died by poisoning. I don't see anyone really disputing that.
Irrelevant. This is not part of the debate.
No, it's entirely relevant because your claim that we need multiple sources. Multiple sources are good, but they are not always necessary. There are many claims that we hold in history based on one source. We could even look at, say how when Vesuvius erupted, we have pretty much...
This is about Jesus, not Socrates. Stick to the subject.
Yes, we are making parallel analogies here. And I'm demonstrating what we know about the ancient world. Okay. Do you know anyone who disputes that Paul wrote 1 Corinthians and or Galatians?
Personally, I don't, but that doesn't mean that what he wrote is true.
I never argued that at all. Do you know any scholar in the field of New Testament or classical history who disputes the claims that I made about the crucifixion and the appearance traditions?
Well, I know one, and you mentioned him. That would be Richard Carrier.
Uh-huh. And what university does Richard Carrier teach at now?
Irrelevant.
It's very, very relevant. No one who teaches in an accredited seminary or university disputes what I've said if they are a scholar in the field. You might find someone in philosophy or science who disputes it, but not someone in the relevant field.
Okay, so see what's happening here. It's okay for you to question my authorities, in quotes, but it's not okay for me to question yours.
Oh, no, you can question mine all you want. When rebuttal time comes for you and you start asking me questions, I hope you question my authorities to no end.
Yeah, my attitude is that authorities may be experts, but that doesn't mean that what they claim is true. I didn't claim
when you meet
that Richard Carrier was claiming a truth either.
When you meet someone who's arguing that position, you can use that line on them, but you are not dealing with someone now. I'm just going by what the leading scholars in the field agree on across the board and what is the best explanation. Now, okay, then looking again at the life of Paul, the main witness I have here, do you accept that Paul died of beheading?
I'm not an expert on Paul, but I don't see why this is relevant to the question of Jesus rising from the dead. We're not talking about Paul and his death. We're talking about Jesus and his rising.
I think it's quite interesting. You keep not wanting to answer questions because you don't think they're relevant.
Give me a
dispute that Paul, do you dispute that Paul wrote 2 Corinthians?
No. But again,
okay.
This is not about Paul. This is about the truth of the claim that Jesus rose from the dead.
Okay, here's what Paul says about himself in 1 Corinthians. It says, I have worked much harder. I've been in prison more frequently, been flogged more severely, been exposed to death again and again. 5 times I received from the Jews for 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I've been constantly on the move. I've been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my fellow Jews, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, and in danger from false believers. I have labored and toiled, and have gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst, and I've often gone without food. I have been cold and naked. Besides everything else, I face daily the pressure of my concern for all the churches. All this stuff that he went through. What are the exact perks he was getting out of being a Christian?
what does this have to do with Jesus? Right? Thank you for giving me the story of Paul's life. It's not relevant to whether or not Jesus rose from the dead.
You got about
John,
30
you
seconds, by
made
the way.
a mistake. What did you say, David?
I'm sorry. You have about 30 seconds, by the way.
Okay, John, this is relevant because you talked about pointing to motives more for what people were doing, why we're doing it. And here, Paul, he kept doing what he was doing, and apparently he was not getting a lot of perks out of it. So that's going to be my final statement for you to respond to.
Okay. You can tell me the story of Harry Potter next, if you like.
Okay, then I suppose that is time for the first round here. I'll let Nick take a drink. And Nick, are you ready?
Yeah.
John, are you ready?
Sure.
Begin when you may.
What is this next part supposed to be like?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
What is this next part supposed to be like? This is me asking.
Oh.
Nick.
This is, yeah, I'm sorry. I haven't started time yet because I was a little bit confused with what you were saying as well. Yeah, this is your chance to put him in the hot seat, ask him questions where he's not supposed to ask questions in return. And then after that, you guys will get 10 minutes as a hopefully respectful free for all.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you mentioned that the copycats were not. I'm not sure why you disliked. It was your idea to try and diss the copycat tales in the first place, Nick. And then I pointed out that they preceded the Jesus story, and therefore, if anything, Jesus was a copycat of them. Can't be the other way around. And you came back at me and said that the Christians weren't aware of them, and you also said that they weren't written by the Christians or some such. I don't know what you said. But my point is, it's not about who knew or who wrote them. It's about whether it's a good story. And it obviously is. You know, it's like Little Red Riding Hood is a good story because there's a wolf that eats a grandmother. And these stories of rising from the dead, they're obviously ripping yarns as well because they got included in so many tales of gods. And incidentally, it's male gods who get this special phenomenon, not female ones. So we wonder whether it might have been male authors. So how do you explain that, Nick? Is it just a good yarn, or can you give me some other substantiation for why Jesus rose from the dead story is reliable?
Okay, I'm going to make sure because there was a lot of breaking up on John's end. So, David, you can tell me, is this question really why is it that I think the story of Jesus should be treated as a real story instead of not just, say, a story like Harry Potter or something? Does that sound accurate?
Yeah. Not just
And
a number.
I paused time for a moment there just to get clarity, and then we'll resume. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. There were stories for entertainment in the ancient world. Everyone knew about them. Normally, they were written long after the fact, and they were written with very clear anachronisms put in there so people would know.
Really?
Don't take this seriously. There's no indication that the story of Jesus was written this way. And when we look at the accounts in Corinthians that are given the creed or statement, there's no indication we're dealing with fiction here. No scholar takes this as if Paul is passing on a fiction here. These are historical accounts. He lists witnesses, and some he says you can go and question them, and he considers himself a witness. And there's no reason to think that he would say, hey, this is a great story. Now I'm going to go out and do all the suffering that he did because of that story. No one in the ancient world treated this like it was just a story and not a historical claim when it was being shared. So if John wants to say that this is just a story, it's going to be up to him to argue with the evidence of New Testament scholars that do not treat it this way, including atheistic New Testament scholars.
Okay, well, straight away you dived into your hidey hole of scholars again, didn't you? Appealing to authority. Yeah. Well, the thing is that it's undeniable that a story that includes a fantastic element, like rising from the dead or being born of a virgin, which is another one that's very popular, you know, or, I don't know, living in a mountain like James Bond's villains do. You know, these are good elements. You want to include them in your stories because they make an audience gulp. You get the person's attention, and then it's like Netflix. They will pay you for entertaining them. Now, the other thing you said about Paul not having a vested interest because he suffered, well, that in itself is another story. So what you're doing now is an ad hoc fallacy. You're piling a claim on top of a claim to try and justify the first one with the second one. So how do you respond to that? Oh no, okay, before you do that, we've flogged that horse to death, haven't we? I want to ask you about meteorites. I know this is not relevant, but you introduced it. So what do you think a meteorite is?
I know there are different stages between meteorites, meteoroids, and meteors based on how they come about. I won't claim to be the expert. I think basically what we're talking about is a rock that falls from the sky and enters Earth's atmosphere and crashes and lands into something so that we can, if we find it, we can pick it up and study it.
Right. Well, I'm now in a position to be able to inform you because a meteor is a visible streak of light in the sky caused by something burning up in the atmosphere at high speed. Okay. You mentioned a shower of meteorites. Mm-hmm. That reveals a misunderstanding. A meteorite is a rock on the ground. It's not what you see in the sky. You can't have a shower of meteorites. It's a shower of meteors. After they've landed, not all of them do. Most of them are just grains of sand that burn up, never reach the ground at all. It's only the larger ones that land and cool off, and you can go and find them and pick up a piece of rock. Those are two quite different things. So your irrelevant story is another reason for being discounted because it's garbled. What do you say to that?
I say if you want to go on the technicalities of language, I think when I describe what I'm talking about with seeing things fall from the sky, most anyone knows what I'm talking about with that. Now, I'd also like to respond to what you said about Paul with the whole ad hocness here. It's so amusing, John. You throw out some stories because you say they're not by witnesses, and then you have Paul's own story, which is this of his own account.
No, that's not good. I'm pausing time. Did we lose Nick?
He's frozen.
He's frozen up.
What?
Oh, you froze there for a second. I paused time.
Okay. This is what Paul says he really went through. He really suffered for all of us because he was 100% convinced Jesus rose from the dead, and he had no wish to believe that prior. He hated Christianity beforehand, as we see in his account in Philippians, which no one again disputes that Paul wrote that. Paul was very much opposed to Christianity, and yet he became its greatest evangelist because he was convinced he had seen the risen Jesus.
Right, final question from me, Nick. What do you think evidence is?
Evidence is a piece of data that can be used to give credence to a claim.
And how would you obtain that data?
How would I what that data?
Obtain that data. What is the source of that data?
It depends on what field you're looking at. For instance, if I gave you the data, my cat is sleeping next to me on the bed, then you could say, Junior, well, that's a non-controversial claim. We can accept that. Or I could just turn, and hopefully you can see that, yep, little guy sound asleep there, and that's a different kind of data. If you're doing scientific data questions, you do experiments. If you're doing literary data, you look at literature and see what it says. If you're doing historical data, you look at historical sources in archaeology. If you're doing philosophical data, you examine the reasoning claims that are brought forward. It depends on the field.
Indeed. Yeah. So, and you mocked me for getting into the technicality of the words meteor and meteorite. Well, now you're saying for philosophical data, you actually need to look at the technicality of the words to see whether they are internally coherent and not contradictory, for example, or valid expressions of logic. So, and you mentioned correctly that there are different standards of evidence. And the one, we've got two that you could apply to the Bible. We've got the scientific claim. Is it scientifically probable that a man, a human, could die and rise, come back to life again? And I've already shown you that out of all the medical evidence we've got, it's never happened. And there's, a lot of medical evidence. So you've got one claim, and that therefore we have to consider it to be a historical claim because it's not scientific. And as I pointed out, you don't have that either because you've only got one source. And for history to be credible, you need multiple, independent, contemporary, corroborating sources.
30 seconds.
So when I pointed out with the death of Socrates, that's not accurate. And most of the history that we have in the ancient world is not contemporary at all. If we were talking about, say, Hannibal, for instance, we do not have contemporary evidence of Hannibal. The most evidence we have comes 40 to 80 years later. Alexander the Great, much, much later. If we were talking about the destruction of Herculaneum and Pompeii in the Vesuvius eruption, the account we have of Herculaneum being destroyed comes much later in Cassius Dio's writings. So your idea for how history should be done is really not itself accurate at all. And the best way you can learn is just go read some historical scholars in the field.
Now you're getting
and that's
condescending.
Okay, and that's time for the cross-examination portion. We will now have 10 minutes where you guys are free to discuss and have a back and forth. Again, let's try to keep our tone respectful with each other. And I'll go ahead, start time, and you guys can have at it.
And what are we doing exactly, and how long do we have?
You have 10 minutes basically to follow up on any questions that you may still want to ask or respond to other things that you may not have had time to.
Okay. So it's a conversation, Nick. You okay with that?
Sure. 10 minutes to talk. Okay.
Right. Well, I was interested that your final thrust a minute ago was an attempt to discredit the whole of history. You pointed out that the evidence for characters like Hannibal and Socrates and the event like the eruption of, what was it, Herculaneum and other things are not 100% certain. Well, I agree, but discrediting the whole of history does nothing to substantiate your claim that Jesus rose from the dead. Stick to the topic.
John, that's not what I was doing at all. In fact, I don't know anyone who disputes any of the claims that I just made about Hannibal or Vesuvius and destruction of Herculaneum or the death of Socrates or any of these. The whole point was to show that these are accepted on historical grounds, and they are not accepted based on your idea of what is supposed to be used for history. But if you were going to go with history, I've given you a creed that dates to within 5 years of the event, which in the ancient world is a blip on the time screen. That if we had evidence like this for anyone else in the ancient world, we would be absolutely ecstatic to have it. So my whole thing was not to discredit history. It was to show your idea of how history should be done is entirely problematic.
I get it. Okay, I get it. But the thing is that there are standards, and some of them have to be low. And if you don't have contemporary, independent, multiple, confirmatory evidence, then you've got to lower the bar. Is what you are saying that you've lowered the bar so low for Jesus, you're happy to accept one source of information?
No, not at all. I'm saying your claim about contemporary and things of that sort is a made-up rule that is used today in order to discredit Jesus, when I would contend, and this would be from the rate, that we do have contemporary accounts of the life and death of Jesus. It's just saying the best place to go for the data that we have is the Pauline epistles,
which have all been compiled into one book by one group of editors who had a mission to make a religion that helped the failing Roman state to survive.
Can you give any backing from any scholar that says that the book was put together to help the failing Roman state survive?
Well, I do know that some of the accounts that were considered for inclusion didn't make the grade. We call them the Gnostic Gospels, and they got left on the cutting room floor, presumably because their standard of credibility wasn't high enough.
John, there is no canon list that we have whatsoever that the Gnostic Gospels were on. The Gnostic Gospels were not even up for consideration. And when you look at the Council of Nicaea, we have the minutes from the Council of Nicaea. We have what was discussed there and was put together. The Gospels and which ones were accepted and which ones were not was not even discussed at Nicaea. That is an atheist myth.
Well, it's interesting that when you wanted to prove that your cat existed, you turned your camera and showed me live stream evidence. Very convincing. Do that for Jesus and his rising from the dead, please.
Why should I? John, you're going by a claim again, if we did this, we would rule out all historical evidence. Show me historical evidence that with a live stream that Julius Caesar was killed on the Ides of March by his fellow men in the Senate. You don't have it. Oh, okay. Then Julius Caesar was not put to death on the Ides of March. This is a ridiculous claim. And again,
Well,
I noticed that when it came to
what I was doing was agreeing with your idea then of what would convince me. You turned your camera, you showed me a live cat live streamed from your home. Mm-hmm. Now, you can't do that. I accept that you can't do that for Jesus. And what worries me is that you can't do the other things. You bring up Julius Caesar. There's busts of him. His face is on the coins. There's lots of different independent, congruent accounts of what went on during his reign. There's evidence of when he died, of when he was born, and so on and so forth. Can you give me that then for Jesus? I'll give you another chance.
It's so amusing that we're now making comparison and saying we should have the same amount of data for the emperor that sat and ruled the Roman Empire as we do for a guy who was crucified on a cross and who was seen as a disgrace to his people. No, the data amount is going to be different because in the ancient world, Jesus was not worth talking about. And few people would want to write about him, except as far as the thing is, several non-Christians at the time did write about him. And John, I know you haven't really said anything to the thing I point out that you gave a very inaccurate history of Constantine and the Gospels being selected. And it seems like you easily buy into these claims. Do you ever look for the evidence of these claims that you get, such as the Gnostic Gospels being open for consideration into the canon?
Well, I accept your excuses for why there isn't such written evidence for Jesus as there is for Julius Caesar. I accept that you have lowered the bar right down so that you don't require such evidence. You don't You can't produce a camera shot of him. That would be scientific. You can't produce contemporary, independent, multiple sources of producing the same information of him. So now, where is your bar? Is it an inch above your ground, or where?
John, my bar is the same bar that's used by New Testament scholars across the field. Christian, atheist, conservative, liberal, all of us, we all play by the same rules. And again, once again, I ask you, do you accept atheist myths such as ones about the Council of Nicaea without looking at the evidence?
I've no idea. I'm not an expert myself.
I think I do, because you presented it as if it was a factual claim. And I'm wondering, did you look at the evidence for what you claimed about the Council of Nicaea?
If you go to Wikipedia, for example, I know you're going to rubbish that. Then you will find dates and information about the Council of Nicaea. There were two, for example, and you will know, for example, that although they were set up by Constantine, he died before they completed. There were quite a lot of information about the Council of Nicaea if you want to become an expert in it. I don't. I'm a skeptic. I'm the one who's asking you for convincing evidence. And the Council of Nicaea is a rabbit hole that we don't need to go down. Please provide me with evidence for Jesus rising from the dead.
Well, John, you brought this up with the Council of Nicaea. I didn't. But before I go to your other question, here's another scholar. There are also a lot of people who think, I base this on a number of times I hear this on, or I'm asked about it, that it was at the Council of Nicaea that the canon of the New Testament was decided. That is, when Christian leaders allegedly decide which books would be accepted in the New Testament and which ones would be left out. That too is wrong. That's Barderman's post about widespread misconceptions about the Council of Nicaea, which again you've bought into entirely. Now, the evidence that Jesus rose from the dead, I've given this. I've given that he lived, that he died, that he was buried, and that he was seen alive. Again, not one of these pieces of evidence has been disputed so far, and nothing has been given to explain them.
1 minute, guys.
You start out being condescending, suggesting I need to improve my education, and then you straw man me by saying that I've bought into some scholar, because you love scholars, who claim to know stuff. I haven't. I'm a skeptic. I'm the guy who doesn't know. I'm the guy that you could convince, but I think you've admitted during the course of this show that you don't have scientific evidence, and neither do you have historical evidence to support your claim.
Not at all. I've given the historical evidence. I've given it by citing New Testament scholars and what they believe and why. And your response has just been to dismiss scholars. This is like saying, go ahead and give me the evidence for evolution. By the way, I'm going to dismiss anything that's said from a scientist. Throw that out.
No, it's not. That's different. Let me finish with this. The evidence for evolution is not from scholars. It's visible, right? And I'm not dismissing all scholars. I am saying that it isn't essential or necessary to believe what they claim as true. We should criticize. We should examine. We should be skeptical. We should use careful thought.
I agree. We should be skeptical. We should use careful thought. But at the same time, when we use that careful thought, we should go to the people who are the greatest experts in the field, since very few of us will study something for a lifetime. We all have to rely on experts many times. And I've done that by going to the New Testament scholars in the field who know what I'm talking about. And the ones that don't have skin in the game, they're not out there trying to popularize Christianity. They're just trying to understand historical Jesus.
Gotcha. Okay, and we're gonna have to end it there. That's the end of the 10 minutes. I'm going to let you guys do closings now. I can't remember who started. Whoever started should go.
I started.
So you started. So John, we'll let you go first on closings. I'm going to give you 3 minutes to close out your thoughts, and then we will go to Nick, and then maybe address some of these comments if you guys want to hang out afterwards. But that's up to you guys. All right.
Okay, well, picking up on what Nick said about experts, of course, we all need to use experts. I have a doctor, I've had an operation, and I'm on pills. But some of the pills that I am on are under dispute. I take statins, and there's about half the experts who think they're a good idea, and about the other, maybe a quarter, think they're not a good idea. So what I'm telling you is that experts do not have special access to the truth. Nothing is 100% certain. And what we need is something that's convincing, and that requires evidence. And if I want to check up on my pills, I can look at the evidence that says they're good for me and the evidence that says they're not good for me and make my own judgment. Now, my contention is that during the course of this debate, Nick has not come up with any evidence. What he's come up with is claims, and we have no way of checking whether they're true or not. That's enough for me. Thank you.
Okay, you were seating 145. You're okay with that?
Sure.
Okay. Nick?
Okay, I state at this point that I've presented the evidence from the experts in the field, the scholars, the ones that spend their lives studying all of this and rank their reputations on getting something right. That a bunch of scholars believe something doesn't mean it's true, but it means they think there's a strong reason to think it's true, and we should look at those reasons. And this is what I would encourage people to do. Go out there, read the books, learn about history, read both sides of the issue. There are wonderful scholars who are conservative Christians who are making the case for the resurrection of Jesus. There are wonderful scholars who are agnostic atheists and liberals with approach to the text who are making the case against the resurrection of Jesus. Go. Read all of them that you can. Look at them. See what they say. Now, I contend John hasn't done this, and as I showed in my presentation, John himself buys into a lot of atheist myths, apparently, and this is something that we can all be prone to do, unfortunately. It's easy to just believe something because it agrees with what you already want to be true or think to be true. But if we are going to be true skeptics and true investigators, we should look and examine every single claim that we get and test it and see. It's too easy to believe what supports your side immediately and discount the other one. The evidence is strong enough that I've presented to convince people that Jesus rose from the dead. It has not been disputed here. I presented central facts of data accepted by New Testament scholars, and just throwing them out the window does not work. They have to be wrestled with. And if John doesn't want to, then I encourage you all in the audience, go out there, read the books. There is no excuse for a lack of vigorous study in a field like this one. And that's going to be my time.
Very good. That is your time. You're seating 46 seconds.
Yep.
Gentlemen, I suppose we've not settled the matter. Much as I suspected at the outset, but this is really good, spirited debate. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the back and forth. This has been a lot of fun for me. If you guys are up for hanging out for a couple more minutes, I wanted to look through a couple of these comments and things, and if anybody wanted to field them, are you guys comfortable with that?
Sure.
Yeah, and before we go, I would like to make another reminder about the possible show we're going to be doing later on, David.
Definitely, yes. So I'm going to read this first one. Jeremy, who's been very active in the chat, he wanted to know what you gentlemen both thought of the biblical definition of faith. Now, faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. By faith, we understand the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. What I'm guessing these responses are going to be night and day. Go ahead, John.
Faith is an alternative for evidence, and it's not a very good alternative, I'm afraid. I actually have a definition of faith for myself, and it stems from belief, because faith is strong belief, isn't it? I think there's no argument there. So My contention is that a belief is a chosen attitude towards a proposition, and faith is a belief on steroids.
Well, there you go. Nick, what are your thoughts, sir?
Yeah, faith is one of those very badly misunderstood words today. The Greek word is pistos. That's used in important forms like pisteuo and things like that, because Greek itching, the verbs and nouns differ based on how they end in the language. And faith was in the ancient world a sort of trust. Okay, in the ancient world, let's suppose you're a rich man, and I live in the ancient world, and I want to have a bakery. And I go to you because I don't have money. And I say, David, will you give me money so I can start a bakery? And you say, okay, I'll give you some money, start a bakery. And then when I start one, people come in and buy bread. And I say, this bread is here for you because David is so kind to generous to give this money so you all can have bread, which builds up your reputation in the ancient world. Now, that loyalty that I show to you is called pistos in that world. And the gift that you gave me originally is called careless, which is a word we translate as grace. When Paul uses these terms, he's using terms in the marketplace. So what's going on in Hebrews here? Okay, now we have to remember when the Bible was originally written, including each of the letters, there weren't any chapters or verses. They were put in later. So at the end of Hebrews 10, we have this warning about apostasy and saying, don't fall away. And then the writer goes on to say, but we expect better things from you. We expect loyalty to you. And he points to the people that went before us. What he's saying is that you are going to trust God like these people did, who did not see what was there before them, but trusted that God was reliable and would fulfill his promise. The idea of faith as being blind belief or belief without evidence, as commonly put out by new atheists, is just entirely false. There is nothing like it in the ancient world. Faith is belief in the ancient world, trust acted on based on evidence that has been given.
I feel like this could become its own debate, like faith, like meaning and purpose and how it's used, because there's a language game involved here, right? And we get wrapped around the axle, sort of equivocating against each other very often in the use of the term faith.
It's just that there's another comment here that says, would we be better off to separate faith and science? And I'd like to respond to that.
Please do.
Okay, so yes, I agree. There's three terms, and Nick has already mentioned trust. But there's three terms which are sort of a bit interchangeable in common language, but they aren't really. There's confidence, which is empirical. It's quantifiable. It's a statistical measure. You can have confidence that you're, because of all the thousands of miles that planes have flown without crashing, the likelihood is very low that you're going to be on a plane that crashes. Or you can have confidence that because 8 times as many people die on a motorcycle, then you've got quite a high probability. That's a measure of confidence. Trust is something else. It's qualifiable because you can have a record of unmeasurable things that give you a trust. Your wife has always been loyal, for example, so you expect that she will continue to be, you trust her in future. And then there's faith, which has nothing. It's neither quantifiable nor qualifiable. It's just a punt. Science doesn't do that.
Okay. I want to move on. Again, this could turn into a whole debate by itself. I don't want to do that. I want to go over one or two more questions here. William has chimed in. Welcome, William. Question for John: do you think the historical Jesus existed? Why or why not? And if not, how do you respond to people like Bart Ehrman who are convinced that Jesus really did exist?
I'm not so sure that Bart Ehrman does think that now. He used to be an agnostic, but I think now he's turned fully atheist. And of course, those words are disputable as well. And that could be another debate in its own right. So, but listen, I'm not the person whose opinion matters. It's not important whether I think that Bart Ehrman is right and that Jesus did or did not exist. I'm the person who's a skeptic. I'm the one who you are seeking to convince, and you haven't.
Okay, I suppose I get to respond to that.
Yes, you do, sir.
Bart Ehrman has written a whole book, Did Jesus Exist?, to argue against this bizarre notion that Jesus never even existed. You can find a clip of him at the Dan Barker's group, Freedom from Religion Foundation, I believe it is, with him arguing against this idea and saying, you guys, you really don't need to go down this way, because he says, you make yourselves look dumb when you do this.
Okay. Let me see here. Dennis, who's also been active with us, this is not about how the word is defined, but how it is being used. He's referring to faith here, I believe. You cannot appeal to a definition if you're applying the word differently. You guys have thoughts on that? That does kind of go back to sort of the different definitions and applications of faith. I'm going to stay out of this. I'm going to let you guys express your own thoughts. I have plenty of my own thoughts, but that's not what I'm here today. So you guys go ahead.
Can I follow up on the Bart Ehrman issue there? He did write a book called Did Jesus Exist? I've just Googled it. And he wrote it. It was published in 2012, 10 years ago. Man's changed his mind.
Okay, first off, I want to make sure, can you all still hear me? Because someone's mowing the lawn outside. Okay.
Yeah,
Look,
there's a bit of noise, but we can hear you.
And there's no indication he's changed his mind, because he's still writing books on the historical Jesus over and over. He debated Robert Price a few years ago at this on Memphis, Milwaukee, still arguing against the idea that Jesus never even existed. Again, this is not something that's taken seriously in scholarly circles. If you want to, you can go ahead and email him and ask him, hey, do you think Jesus existed? And yes, that book, Did Jesus Exist? I've got it. It's a wonderful book. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I encourage everyone to read it.
I will ask him. I'll ask him if he'll come on my show. Certainly, it's a good idea. But
very good.
I think in his more recent YouTube appearances, he comes out more firmly as an atheist, whatever that means.
And that could be a whole other debate, and is.
Of course, he will write more books. That's how he earns his living.
Yeah, which is important because the scholars that I cite, by and large, are atheists and agnostics who don't have a Christian axe to grind and yet have no problem with the claims that I made. And as for Bart Ehrman, like as soon as he releases a new book, I'm one of the first people in line buying it immediately and reading straight through it.
Very good, guys. I'm gonna go ahead. We're gonna bring it to a close here because this is probably and lovely comments, everybody. Thank you for your participation in that. I love fielding questions personally in live chats. I get a big kick out of it. I don't want to get too distracted from the central topic we were at here. We're going to go ahead and wrap here. I'm going to give you guys each final opportunity to plug yourselves. John, I'll let you go first.
Yeah, thank you. My stuff can be found on Free Thought Productions channel. And there's over 200 videos there for you to peruse. I've interviewed all sorts of people. I've had more than 100 interviews already with, I'll talk to anybody, scholars and non-scholars. The final thing I want to say is that going by Bayesian probability, 100 million humans have died and not risen. One is claimed to have risen.
Very good. Nick, would you like to plug your work, sir?
Certainly. I can be found at deeperwatersapologetics.com. I do have several podcast episodes that I've done, interviewing leading scholars again on various topics. And hopefully once I get to seminary, assuming I do, which seems very likely, I will be able to start doing that again. I really miss doing that. It's a lot of fun. I do hope that we will be on with David again soon, me and hopefully my friend Erin Burnett, who's also in the UK. She's written a great book, Autism and Church, a little book that you can read in about 2 to 3 hours or so. I highly support the booklet. I mean, I don't agree with everything, but for the most part, it is an excellent read. So I highly encourage everyone to read it. And please do remember, it is Autism Awareness Month. I don't know if it is in the UK, but over here in the good old US of A, it is Autism Awareness Month. And be remember that, because sometimes I know being on the spectrum, people can treat me in a way that they don't know me. You know, they think I'm being rude at times, and they don't realize it's really autism at work here. And so please keep that in mind. I hope we'll be able to do this show again. And of course, in case anyone is questioning this, I do affirm a virgin birth.
Very good. Yeah, I was waiting. I was like, I was going to bring it up if you didn't. But thank you, gentlemen, both for participating. For myself, you're on Fermenting Opinions, the podcast in search for more palatable political ferment. I do delve into philosophy and matters of religion as well, because those are my interests. That's what I do. You can find me on pretty much all the social media platforms and YouTube as well under the Fermenting Opinions banner. Again, thank you both for your time coming out. Nick, really appreciate you sticking with it. I know you weren't feeling great. You rallied. You guys both did a great job. And I look forward to doing it again. So that said, I'm David Propiden, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, David. Thank you, viewers.